a follower of the Center for Chinese Studies, you can go to our website, the UCLA Center for Chinese Studies website. We have a listserv where you can sign up and get regular notifications about upcoming events. We also have a Facebook page where you can follow us there for information on events. And finally, we also have a YouTube archive of past lectures, which we encourage you to explore. We have a few more events coming up this quarter, but we are winding down a little. And it's so good to see such a robust attendance online today for today. I'm going to pass the virtual podium over to my colleague, Professor Weishu Li from the Department of Art History. She is a specialist in Chinese art, and she will have the distinct pleasure of introducing today's speaker. So, Weishu.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Stephen. It's really great pleasure. I haven't seen Stephen for almost two decades. Even I've been following his work. He's one of the most energetic, productive young scholars. Professor Stephen Whiteman is now a senior lecturer in Art and Architecture of China at the Courtauld Institute of Art, University of London. Before joining Courtauld Institute of Art, he taught at University of Sydney, and he also received his PhD from Stanford University. His advisor, Professor Rick Winograd, were all acquaintances. As mentioned, he's extremely productive. So his research and teaching focus on a wide range on the visual and spatial cultures of early modern China early modern China, and also in their global context. He has two published books. One's recent, but also very well received. Already have a Chinese translation. I actually have both the book and the Chinese version, where Dragon Van meets the Kangxi Emperor and his estate at Rehe. Wonderful Chinese translation. Leng Mei, Kangxi Di与避暑山庄. And before this 2020 book, major substantial book, very well received from University of Washington Press, he also the co-author of a book, 36 Views, Kangxi Emperor's Mountain Estate in Poetry and Print. And interesting is collaborate with our colleagues who retired a few years ago, Professor Richard Strasberg. And that was published in 2016. And he has two books I know, is done and will be published very soon. One is a collection of the 10 essays titled Landscape and Authority in the Early Modern World. And the fourth book, titled Under Heaven and Within the Sea, Mapping China since 1000, year 1000. So these are the huge projects. He is by training expert in the early modern, particularly Qing and Qing garden culture, also court art. But I see he keep expanding. Now it's all the connectedness, of early modern, China to the world, or vice versa. And that's really the fast rising field. So I've been really eager to hear, him talk about his project. So today's project actually is part of his book, Where Dragon Then Meets. And one thing I would also like to mention, his first book collaborated with Professor Richard Strasberg. So at UCLA, we actually also have a legacy. Professor Strasberg is very into, Chinese garden culture. So in our East Asian study, there's a course in the book, used to taught by Professor Strasberg. Now is Professor Mai Huijun. And I have also started teaching Chinese garden in Chinese art and culture for more than 15 years. And then we have a Huntington Chinese Garden. So there's a big presence at in LA. So I think this has been long awaited that to have Professor Whiteman have a lecture on our campus. And I also like to mention the Professor Whiteman is really the new generation, extremely tech savvy. So this is something I truly admire. So on the digital front, he also has many projects, including one, science and space in Southeast Asia. And this was, sponsored by the Getty Research Institute, our neighbor. And many others. I just, truly admirable that he has all his energy and all the vision, and spearheaded, taking us to the future. So without further ado, please join me. Welcome, Professor Whiteman.
Professor Lee, thank you so much for that. And Professor Berry, thank you so much for having me and for that very warm introduction. I hope this evening or this afternoon's talk lives up to that standard. And thank you all for coming to hear. I have a little bit longer talk than I'd hoped to cut it down to. And so I'll get started and then hopefully have some good time at the end for questions. See if I can actually get my slides to move forward. There we are. Extending over 2.5 meters high and nearly 2 meters wide, the view of Rehe opens corolla-like before the viewer. In it, the Kangxi Emperor's newly constructed Rehe traveling palace lays nestled in a protective ring of bluish-green mountains, which climb in layered forms from the valley floor. Carefully depicted courtyards and halls are precisely arrayed around the lakes and in the hills along the left side of the composition. In open spaces and among the trees, cranes and deer stand singly and in pairs, while 2 geese, birds of the steppe, fly northwest across the lower lakes. The landscape is otherwise devoid of living creatures. Several boats, a few garden tools, and a lantern and banner hung outside a hall are the only signs of human habitation, as if the imperial estate awaits its royal occupants. The composition is highly unusual for its creator, Leng Mei, an artist in the early Qing court best known for figure paintings in divine or mytho-historical narratives, often in small album formats. Located in modern Chengde, Hebei province, and constructed by Kangxi and his grandson, the Qianlong Emperor, in multiple stages over the course of the 18th century, the 1,400-acre park palace depicted in Leng Mei's painting has largely been studied through its later architectural forms and the impressionistic landscape presented in the 2 emperors' sets of scenic sites. In my recent book, Where Dragon Veins Meet, the Kangxi Emperor and his estate at Rehe, which Professor Lee so generously introduced, I sought to extend the Rehe landscape, both the physical site and its many interpretations, by interpreting it as a response to and product of the richly connected early modern Qing Empire. The traveling palace's social and political valences relied integrally on emerging understandings of pictures, science, and space in the Kangxi court, combining references to the past, innovative technologies, and multivalent connections between real and pictorial environments to convey a complex notion of early modern rulership. Expressed through a range of materials and media, including imperial poetry, travelogues, pictorial tours of the Park Palace and the site itself. The court's use of landscape to articulate imperial authority takes especially compelling form in view of Rehe. Leng Mei was among a group of court artists active in the late 17th and early 18th centuries who sought to define a new pictorial mode through which they recorded imperial territory and environments, moral and didactic themes, and the emperor himself. View of Rehe reflects an admixture of stylistic modes, generic leitmotifs, and parapictorial references drawn from Chinese painting and the court's own evolving landscape manner. Integrating local and foreign elements into a coherent visuality, Leng Mei and his fellow court artists conveyed the intra-Qing and trans-Eurasian cosmopolitan underpinnings of Kangxi's rulership. Understanding the formal and technical underpinnings of Leng Mei's view of Rehe positions the painting as more than a mimetic record of the primary site. It embodies the court's evolving triangulation of landscape, technology, and emperorship within the currents of ideas moving back and forth across early modern Eurasia. Bishu Shandong provided Kangxi's nascent regime with a site for the performance of imperial authority for a range of constituents, simultaneously drawing on traditions of past social and political regimes and repositioning the court vis-a-vis China proper, Inner Asia, and Europe. Leng Mei's image does the same by combining a pictorial rhetoric drawn from contemporary court practice, layered with vocabularies of historicity and auspiciousness, and the veristic qualities required to make the new northern seat of power recognizable. In this sense, it acts as a sort of portrait, communicating through the tension between objective portrayal and subjective presentation. By incorporating both historic and contemporary artistic modes, it also may be understood as a pictorial metaphor for the legitimization of a newly established regime. Generally speaking, view of Rehe fits within the tradition of palace paintings, a subgenre of history painting often invested with mytho-historical qualities. Emperor Ming Huang's palace to escape the heat on the right, traditionally attributed to the court painter Guo Zhongshu, is a quintessential example. Ascending the right side of the composition are the serried halls of the Palace of Nine Perfections, an imperial retreat located in the hills outside the Tang capital of Chang'an. Already by the 10th century, a remembered landscape interweaving history and legend, the palace, supposedly so massive that a horse was needed to navigate its lengthy corridors, suggests the glories of the Tang and was identified by Kangxi as a paradigmatic example of retreat as a strategy for sage and effective rule. In Emperor Ming Huang's palace, compositional focus is on the towering forms of the imperial halls, their elaborate eaves and endless colonnade corridors carefully rendered in jiehua, the technique for which Guo Zhongshu is best remembered. Soaring mountain forms in the distance echo the heights of the palace, and perhaps relate to understandings of great peaks as a metaphor for Confucian social hierarchies. They also locate the palace physically and conceptually, emphasizing its position beyond the distractions of the city, suggesting the refinement of remoteness, and drawing upon their status as liminal spaces between mundane and immortal realms. In view of Rehe, the relative prominence of these pictorial elements is essentially reversed. Its architecture appears almost jewel-like, set within a much grander but still meticulously constructed landscape. Like Guo Zhongshu, Leng Mei employs a form of jiehua, albeit one less exhaustively detailed, more naturalistic, and smaller in scale. Precise architectural rendering emerged in Buddhist painting of the 6th dynasty and Tang, if not before, and was used in illustrations of divine and royal palaces, associations that persisted with the style. Executed with straight edges, compasses, and squares, tools of measurement and regulation, jiehua was established as a formal technique by the Song dynasty. Its use in architectural manuals and technical renderings of complex structures led the style to be linked to imperial power through the control of technology and labor. These connotations naturally extended to jiehua's use in depictions of urban scenes in the built environment, such as Qingming Shanghe Tu, or going upriver at Qingmingtang. Attributed to Zhang Zedong, the hand scroll offers a detailed record of the bustling northern Song capital of Kaifeng that has long been interpreted as an image of prosperity and harmony, and thus the virtue of Song imperial rule. Alert to such connections, Qing court painters explicitly quoted Qingming's composition, iconography, and architectural style in creating their own images of the Qing Empire at peace. A series of 12 monumental hand scrolls entitled the Kangxi Emperor's Southern Inspection Tours, executed by the Orthodox master Wang Hui and a bevy of assistants, describes the Qing South as vibrant, ordered cityscapes, buoyant with commerce. Recording the Emperor's 1689 tour, it suggests an urban analog to Kangxi's vision of a productive and a harmonious agriculturalism, expressed through the Rehe landscape. Wang Hui's construction of space combines shifting points of view and ground planes in order to create a sense of compositional continuity within the progressive, almost cinematic hand scroll format. This dynamic approach to space, together with Wang's use of an aerial three-quarter vantage characteristic of jiehua in the Kangxi court, is a key model for understanding Leng Mei's composition. Leng Mei's treatment of the landscape in view of Rehe combines reference to long-standing pictorial conventions and such contemporary developments at court. His manner draws on that of the so-called orthodox school, which dominated late Kangxi court painting theory under Gao Shiqi and Wang Yuanqi, whose painting you see on the right here, and emerged as the leading mode in court landscape beginning with Wang Hui and the Southern Tour project. In particular, View of Rehe follows Wang Hui's efforts towards a great synthesis of the orthodox lineage and its adaptation to the pictorial demands of the ideologically maturing Kangxi court. Leng Mei combines elements of Song monumentality and the archaizing Qing or blue-green palette, with brushwork and compositional strategies derived particularly from Huanggong Wang, held by both Wang Hui and Wang Yuanqi to be the greatest of the Yuan dynasty masters. The peaks that rise up on both sides in View of Rehe are formed from a succession of graduated mounds given shape by colored washes and the delicate layering of dry pimatsun, or hemp fiber strokes, which build upon one another to create winding chains that move simultaneously up and back into pictorial space. At the same time, like the peaks that stand mistily in the distance behind Guo Zhongshu's Palace of the Nine Perfections, both composition and scale in View of Rehe evoke the so-called monumental landscapes of the Five Dynasties and Song courts. Although more intimate compositions and formats based on Yuan models predominated in intervening periods, interest in earlier masters was revived under the influence of Wang Hui and Wang Yuanqi. As such, the court style engendered by Wang Hui and the Orthodox school bridged court and literati manners across a range of dynastic periods. It may be thought of as synthesizing not only the history of painting, but history itself, the merging of artistic paragons into a single coherent composition, serving as an effective metaphor for the Qing's own interest in establishing legitimacy through diverse cultural, political, and territorial precedents. The Qing court style was not limited to an abstract expression of imperial legitimacy through stylistic and compositional reference, however. Late Kangxi painters combined formal and thematic elements to construct images of auspicious landscapes that functioned as metaphors for imperial virtue and the empire, particularly through connections with mytho-historical themes. Blue-green landscape, which originated in the Tang, if not earlier, was by the Song clearly associated with portrayals of immortal realms and, by extension, paradisiacal retreats, such as Tao Yanming's Peach Blossom Spring, a site of fleeting escape from chaotic times. With similar connotations to Jiehua, the two manners, Qinglu, blue-green, and Jiehua, were often used in tandem, including in the Qing, when monumental depictions of mytho-historical and immortal realms were popular in both courtly and commercial painting. The blue-green landscape, or the blue-green palette adopted by Leng Mei, Wang Hui, and others in the Qing court generally relied on thinner washes rather than the dense mineral pigments used by earlier practitioners, and often incorporated other hues, especially light browns and pinks. Formally, these variations may be partially indebted to the influence of Huanggong Wang, whose use of pale color was frequently referenced by late Ming and early Qing dynasty adherents to his style. In practice, however, like the less rigid Jiehua style seen in View of Rehe and elsewhere, they also contributed to an increased sense of naturalism. Leng Mei's use of blue and green in Jiehua creates an image of a place apart, a site evoking not only historical paradigms of legitimate and sage rule, but also an auspicious space on the border between the mundane and sacred worlds. And it should be said that the picture on the right, it also represents a point at the border between mundane and sacred worlds, as this is Mount Tai, the most sacred of mountains in China, being visited or shortly to be visited by the Kangxi Emperor. This status of its sort of auspicious space, this status is reinforced by the depiction of cranes and deer within the composition. This combination of motifs and styles can be found elsewhere in the early 18th century court painting, reinforcing the associations they bring to the View of Rehe. In Yangzheng Tuze, Nurturing Uprightness, for instance, Leng Mei portrays ancient emperors in idealized palace settings. baseline didactic theme originating in the Song period, nurturing uprightness, depicts paragons of benevolent and righteous rule as analogies for the current regime. And you can see that they have cranes in the forecourt symbolizing or signaling this virtue. In view of Rehe, as in Wang Hui's Southern Inspection Tour, the pictorial vocabulary was extended to the physical territory of the Qing itself, depicted in a manner suggestive of reading both imperial precincts and the empire as a whole as paradises on earth. The auspiciousness of the Rehe landscape is highlighted through Leng Mei's deliberate use of another formal element of Orthodox painting, the dragon vein, or Leng Mei. Originally referring to flows of geomantic energy within the earth, in the painting theory of Wang Yuanqi current in the early 18th century court, dragon veins describe chains of mountains that rise and fall and open and close to give a painting compositional and perhaps metaphysical energy. Along each side of view of Rehe, long veins of mountains frame the composition. Beginning in the foreground, near the valley floor, the veins ascend, twisting and turning, disappearing and reappearing to reach a distant peak near the top of the picture plane. While primarily a compositional device in Wang Yuanqi's practice, in certain Qing court works, veins appear to connote the presence of geomantic energy in particular topographic contexts. An anonymous, undated court painting of Fuling, the imperial tomb of Nurhaci, the Qing dynasty founder, serves to illustrate this. Rising in angled, parallel, tiered mountains encircling the tomb, tilting it towards the viewer rather than rising around it, as in Leng Mei's work. The purpose is ultimately the same, however, depicting the embrace of a significant imperial compound within an auspicious web of geomantic energy. Geomancy may also have factored into the composition of view of Rehe in another way. Comparing the painting to a topographical map, and just to sort of orient you so that you can see, can you see my cursor? I hope you can. You'll see these lakes here with some buildings. Those are the lakes we're looking at here. And for those of you who are less familiar with topographical maps, this sort of dense series, which we're going to see a lot of in the next 15 minutes, this dense series of lines suggests mountains. Where there are no lines, it suggests that it's flat, and then the lines again are mountains. So these lines correspond to these mountains, and this sort of white area here corresponds to this area in the center of the painting. Comparing the painting to a topographical map, as I've just done, the mountains along the left side, along the right side of the scroll appear closer to the eastern wall of the park than they are in reality, in effect narrowing the valley and encircling it in a nearly continuous horseshoe of mountains. One product of this composition is the elision of a key geomantic problem with the site, its openness towards the ghost gate, or Guimen, of the northeast. And the ghost gate, or Guimen, would be here, which of course you see isn't visible in this painting. At the same time, it allows the inclusion of a key scenic feature of the immediate area, the columnar rock formation known as Chime Hammer Peak, which you can see here on the right of the composition, but in reality sits actually even the edge of this map outside of what would be the actual picture panel. Ghost Gate notwithstanding, much about the topography of the mountain estate was unquestionably auspicious. Following classical principles for this fortuitous siting of homes, cities, tombs, and the like, the Rehe Valley possessed numerous desirable attributes, including south-flowing rivers, northern protective mountains, a gentle downward slope from north to south, and, with the early dredging of the lakes, a beneficial balance between mountains and water. Court experts on natural phenomena played a central role, particularly as the project progressed, since officials from the Board of Rights joined those from the Board of Works to ensure an auspicious design. The emperor's description of the natural landscape similarly highlighted signs of positive geomantic energy, including, quote, clear winds in refreshing summers, purple mists, and the fertility of the land. Auspicious signs also manifested literally at the Park Palace through landscape formations, particularly within the central lakes. In a first-hand account of visiting the park in 1708 by the senior official Zhang Yushu, He recalled the emperor comparing the Central Lakes dikes and islands to, quote, a sort of Lingzhe fungus, close quote, a resemblance preserved in the area's name, seen here on the right, a Lingzhe path on an embankment of the clouds, or Jijing Yindi. This image was echoed in Kangxi's I'd had it in Chinese here. Imperial poems on the mountain escape to escape the heat, from which you see is seen here. And this group of islands that you see here is this same group of islands that you see here. So this thing is Jijing Yindi, the Lingzhe path on an embankment of the clouds. This image was echoed in Kangxi's imperial poems on the mountain escape to escape the heat, where the emperor described, quote, an embankment flanked on both sides by water, winds, winds and curves. Excuse me, there's a bedtime going on in the background. I hope it's not disturbing. Winds and curves that divides into 3 paths leading to 3 islands, large and small. They are shaped like a lingzhe or a cluster of cloud flowers or rui, close quote. At one level, immortals' realms and mytho-historical paradises, such as Peach Blossom Spring, seem to run counter to the politics of the late Kangxi period. The emperor of a relatively young dynasty, many of Kangxi's subjects had lived through the wars of conquest, much like those Tao Yunming imagined his poor fishermen escaping. Kangxi's rhetoric of rulership thus strongly foregrounded the Qing's claim to the mandate of heaven, particularly through demonstrations of active and attentive government. Peach Blossom Spring and other paradises, by contrast, suggest disengagement from the problems of the world. Yet in describing the Rehe landscape, the emperor chose terms, purple mists, great mountains and deep gorges, and pavilions among streams and caves that all feature in later commentaries on Peach Blossom Spring, making the connection explicit. By framing the Park Palace in this manner, Leng Mei allowed Rehe to function as a metaphorical landscape for the Qing itself. If, rather than seeing the site simply as a place to which the emperor might escape, it is read as a metonym of the dynasty, then the landscape becomes one not only of place, but also of time. In the Peach Blossom Spring of the Qing, Kangxi's subjects have escaped from the chaotic and perilous world of the Ming. Through its idealized topography, historiographic formal elements, auspicious denizens, and tranquil environment, view of Rehe embodied this vision of empire, framing the emperor's Park Palace as epitomizing, rather than endangering, righteous and humane rule and a harmonious realm. While drawing on well-established modes of picture-making, view of Rehe also reflects innovative approaches and techniques circulating in the Kangxi court, particularly around spatial construction. In it, Leng Mei devised a solution to integrating aspects of perspectival representation within the broad framework of monumental landscape painting. This included not only diminution into space, but also a compositional structure that defines and constitutes the position of the viewer vis-a-vis the painting. While Leng Mei's mountains generally seem to follow Chinese models, the valley most certainly does not. The viewer looks down on an essentially level, continuous ground plane that stretches away from the picture plane and into the distance in a manner almost unprecedented in Chinese painting. Leng Mei constructed his composition through 3 separate lines of vision. One looking up the valley, shown here in red. The second delineating the architecture, shown in blue, and the last directed at the mountains on either sides, which you get a sense of just by looking at the mountains on either sides. The valley floor is defined with a loose single-point perspective that gives shape to the composition as a whole and guides the eye inward, while also effectively describing diminution into space. Most clearly evident in the edges of the valley itself, the orthogonals by which this recession is broadly defined meet atop a low mountain in the distance, which is where that red line ends. Converging just right of center, they described a slightly angled line of vision that cuts across the overall frontality of the composition. The second line of sight, defined by the perspectival diminution of the architecture, originates from the lower right of the composition. Its orthogonals meet outside the composition to the upper left. Together with the upward movement of the mountains, the leftward pull of the architectural orthogonals and the depth of the valley create a compositional tension through 3 intersecting, albeit diverging, visual imperatives that destabilize the composition's presumptive point of view. The valley and verticality of the high peaks define a frontal viewing position that, in turn, implies that the spatial construction of the painting is organized around a stable point of view. The pictorial vantage point, what we might call the painter's eye, is in fact mobile, however, though not in the sense generally understood in Chinese landscape painting. Early painters of monumental landscapes often use shifting points of view, angles of vision, and constructions of ground and depth to create non-continuous yet visually coherent spatial compositions. And to put it briefly for those who are new to this idea, as you look at Guoxi's painting on the right, try to pick any one place where the painter's eye could be situated that would account for everything you see. There is no single point of view that accounts for everything you see in this painting. It only works if the point of view moves around. Leng Mei employs a different strategy, utilizing distinct but related vantage points to fashion the mountains and the valleys separately. The mountains are constructed from along a horizontal line on the left in red that transects the image approximately a third of the way up the composition, roughly between the top of Rehe Island and the northern shore of the lakes. As such, the painter's eye looks down upon the foreground mountains, straight at those in the middle, and up the rising veins of those in the distance. Each mountainous form is depicted from a directly frontal point of view, meaning that the eye shifts from side to side with the movement of the hills. Did that slide just move? Yes. By contrast, the valley is represented from a progressive vantage that moves upward along a central axis as the composition moves into the distance, but remains stable from left to right. The painter's eye thus views the valley at a consistent angle of vision, even as the composition moves into depth, rather than growing flatter and more oblique, as it would if the painter's eye were fixed or the viewer were situated at ground level. This complex system of spatial construction functions in concert with the act of looking. With the hanging scroll hung so its bottom roller sits at or just above the floor, a viewer of 165 to 177 centimeters in the thick-soled boots common to court dress, and this is roughly average height in the early 18th century, would have been looking directly at the upper half of Rehe Island. The heart of the composition, this also corresponds with the approximate line along which the vantage point for the mountain moves. The viewer's physical position thereby reinforced Leng Mei's compositional construction. From eye level, particularly the emperor's eye level, one looks down, straight out, and physically up at the hills in the foreground, middle, and distance of the composition, while at the same time, the vertically mobile vantage point allows the viewer to look up and into the valley as if floating above the landscape and following it into the distance. While European perspective works to position the viewer relative to the composition physically, visually, and psychologically, the mobile vantage points conventionally employed in Chinese painting meant that the relationship between image viewer and physically situated vision was less determined. View of Rehe's resolution of the two traditions is exemplary of a fertile period of artistic experimentation in the court beginning in the 1690s. During that time, Leng Mei, Jiao Bingjian, and others associated with the studio of Italian Jesuit Giovanni Gherardini, who taught perspective in the court around the turn of the century, worked creatively to integrate diverse perspectival techniques into new modes of spatial representation. Like a number of other works produced in the Kangxi court around the same time, View of Rehe relies on a form of accelerated perspective, in which the perspectival illusion is predicated on an ideal and not only predicated, but also furthered by an ideal viewing position. In View of Rehe, Leng Mei devised a system by which depth and height could be addressed, creating an image that incorporated features of ocular perspective into a system of mobile vantage points and multiple pictorial foci. The product was a painting that capitalized on new knowledge and techniques imported from Europe, while retaining the essential pictorial vocabulary and visual legibility of established genres and styles of painting for authority in China. Several aspects of Leng Mei's composition suggest not only an ideal position from which to view the painting, but that the work recreates its view of the Rehe Valley from a specific real-world location as well. Standing before the composition and following it from the bottom to the top, effectively from south to north, the painting's ground plane extends before the viewer. Though essentially even and continuous, a point of discontinuity in the terrain offers a subtle indication that the painting records the scene as it appears in life. In the foreground, an area of pale green is bounded, this area of pale green right here, is bounded by a thin black outline, this line here. Most readily visible in the open space between the architecture and lower mountains in the lower left. So now we're looking here in the overall composition. In the lower right, this same outline marks the boundary between ground and lakes, just above a perimeter gate and hall. So right here. This line denotes not simply visual transition, but a sharp drop in real-world elevation. And here, if you will, we're looking at it from the south in Leng Mei's painting, and here in this print, we're looking at the same view from the north. So this group of buildings is actually over here, but this drop that I'm saying occurs at this line, that's this drop here, this series of hills, which appears a little bit sort of gradual here, but actually does drop off fairly steeply in real life. This line denotes not simply transition, but a sharp drop in real-world elevation. In the painting, the ridge effectively obscures the lower portions of the lakes below. Here, the painting appears to capture not the omniscient bird's eye view, in which all would be taken in, but the scene as if seen from a low angle at some distance away. Mountains just south of the modern city of Chengde, roughly 3 kilometers from the entrance of the mountain estate, provide such a vantage point. So here again is the mountain estate, and here are those mountains that I'm speaking about now. In his record of the mountain estate, an essay that he wrote around 1712, Kangxi wrote of the process of design and planning that preceded construction of the Park Palace. Quote, surveying the contrast between the heights and the plains, the near and far, reviewing the natural formations of the peaks and mountain mists, close quote, the plan for the garden emerged in harmony with the landscape. Though the emperor's language makes specific activities difficult to ascertain, the measurement of elevations and depressions, as well as of distance, echoes that of early Chinese mathematical and cartographic treatises. As long histories of civil engineering, urban planning, and cartography attest, surveying, first of flat plains, such as fields, and then of heights, existed as a progressively more sophisticated branch of practical geometry in China since the Zhou, reaching significant sophistication during the Song. During the Kangxi period, this history was complemented by methods introduced by Jesuits at the court, beginning with astronomy, in which the emperor had particular political interest as it related to the setting of the annual calendar. The court's engagement soon expanded to cartography. Following the conclusion of wars of conquest in the 1690s, the court sponsored a joint European Qing surveying project of the much expanded imperial territories that culminated with the map of a complete survey of imperial territories, created between 1708 and 1718. Leng Mei was not directly involved with any of these projects or the translation and application of pure and applied mathematics that occupied much of the Jesuits' efforts in the court. But his teacher, Jiao Bingzhen, may well have been. In the 1680s, Jiao held a supervisory role in the Astronomical Bureau, where he worked with the Jesuit Francois Verbiest. It has been suggested that Jiao may have learned perspective from the Flemish priest, who is one of several Europeans at the court to introduce the technique to the emperor. Regardless, Jiao was certainly expert in the mathematics that underpinned astronomy, a branch of knowledge understood by both Jesuits and Qing as linked to a range of other fields of applied mathematics, including surveying, cartography, and pictorial perspective. Trigonometric surveying, both small and large scale, was well established at the Qing court by 1703. As such, when the emperor and a cohort of senior officials visited Rehe Lower Camp, which is what Rehe and Chengde used to be called in 1702, surveying and presumably some sort of allied picture making, perspectival or otherwise, were central to their preparations for construction. An edict issued late that summer directed the Board of Works to survey and stake out the park. Memorials shortly after New Year 1703 reported that surveying had commenced, as had the execution of paintings and designs by the Board of Works and the Imperial Household Department, which supervised court painters. Whether Leng Mei took part in the original planning and design of the site or not, small-scale surveying, as well as the relationship between cartographic and pictorial techniques, were thus clearly established in the court by the first decade of the 18th century. Leng's artistic background and the prevailing intellectual environment presses the question of whether the painting's apparent accuracy derives from real-world observation and measurement. Even though the conventional claim that pre-modern landscape painting in China was purely a product of the artist's imagination and studio has been discredited, the prospect that Leng Mei relied on surveying data in creating view of Rehe would be unprecedented. No documentary evidence attesting to this proposition has come to light, and yet the painting, when compared with maps of the site, offers compelling evidence. Referring again to a topographical map, it is apparent that although the Park Palace itself is oriented north-south, the valley angles to the northeast. Broadly speaking, the vista obtained from the south is that of the painting. The valley stretches before the viewer, framed by succeeding ridges of mountains on either side and culminating in low hills in the deep distance. In the painting, 3 buildings align precisely with one another on a trajectory that extends directly to the center of the mountain that serves as the valley's vanishing point. And those 3 buildings are 1, 2, 3, and then to those mountains. The structures are also aligned in the physical landscape. Extended north, a line connecting them identifies the painted valley's vanishing point, somewhere up here, as a low foothold northwest of the future site of Puning Se, a temple constructed in 1755. Extended south, this line perfectly intersects the site of a pavilion that currently stands in the southern foothills. Although the pavilion's original date of construction is not known, it is an ideal location for gaining a clear vista of the park. Oh, sorry, that I should have shown you that map. Forgive me. Anyway, those are the 3 buildings, 1, 2, 3, and on up. Apologies. Projecting a viewshed analysis from the site of a pavilion helps confirm the hypothesis of first-hand observation by explaining aspects of the painting that depart from topographic reality. And I should stop here quickly to say, for those who don't know, a viewshed analysis is a study that can be generated in various types of geographic software that takes a model of the terrain, a 3D model of the terrain, and when you designate a single point in the middle of that model, can tell you what is and isn't the point where supposedly you are standing, can tell you what is and is not visible from that point. Thus, it is an analysis of the viewshed from that given point. This on the right is a viewshed from that viewing pavilion, from the location of that viewing pavilion. Anything in gray is visible. Anything in white is not visible. So you cannot see all of this stuff from where you're standing here. The pavilion stands roughly 90 meters above the park's central lakes and between 3 and 5 kilometers from the southern and northernmost structures that appear in the painting, resulting in an extremely low angle of vision. Again, 90 meters up and 3 to 5 kilometers south. As a consequence, the ridge, this ridge here, that extends from the east across the space between the pavilion and the park is high enough at between 375 and 425 meters above sea level to obscure the visibility of much of the half-moon shaped floodplain that forms the eastern side of the valley, i.e. all of this. The result is a viewshed in which the valley appears nearly straight along its eastern edge, such as so, just as Leng Mei renders it. The low angle of sight also explains the way in which the foreground ridge that I mentioned earlier conceals the near shore of the lake, but not the extent to which it does so. The viewshed analysis indicates that the ridge ought to entirely obscure the lake south of Rehe Island. You can't see that in this viewshed analysis for reasons that I won't explain, but in theory, you shouldn't be able to see any of this, and obviously you can see some of it. Indeed, while Leng Mei has correctly omitted a number of buildings that would have been concealed by various topographical features, several other buildings that should also be hidden appear nonetheless. Their presence may be accounted for by the use of a second viewpoint, a practical requirement for surveying by triangulation. Looking again at the architecture's perspectival orthogonals, the vantage that corresponds with their approximate angle of vision is gained from points along the southern end of the low intervening ridge running between Viewing Pavilion and Park Palace. Looking north-northeast from that ridge, the compounds of the two central islands, Moonlight and the Sound of Rivers Island and Rehe Islands, are nearly aligned, the former just to the left of the latter, which is to say these over here and these just to the left, those just over here, just as they appear in the painting. The centrality of sight in measured observation in Leng Mei's representation of Rehe underlines the close connections that existed not only between branches of applied mathematics, but also between topographic landscape painting and more technical approaches to representing space. In what ways is it useful to think about view of Rehe as map-like, and how do these aspects of the work complicate or expand its operation within the genre of landscape painting? I have to say, now that I'm writing a book about maps in China, I don't like that question nearly as much as I did 4 years ago, but let's go with it anyway. At one level, the early modern cartographic impulse in China as in Europe often arose from interest in accuracy or verisimilitude, and with deeper forms of knowledge felt to be revealed by such priorities. Such concerns overlap productively with smaller scale genres of spatial representation, especially architectural plans. Yet the perception of accuracy, and particularly of the knowledge derived from firsthand observation, also worked rhetorically, allowing images to make claims in support of other pictorial goals. Equally significant, cartographic qualities help suggest some final answers to how Leng Mei's unusual composition came into being, in both visual and technical terms. If Leng Mei's painting is to be considered as a map, it is useful to think of it not as a work of geography, the recording and representation of large-scale fields of spatial knowledge, which was the Kangxi court's primary concern in this area, as we saw earlier in the atlas, but as one of chorography. Chorography records the small scale and the local, city views and water systems, villages and temples. In both China and Europe, the chorographic tradition combined descriptive and rhetorical qualities. This underlines the communicative imperative of mapmaking, namely that quantitative veracity is but one way in which a map may be thought of as accurate or truthful, and that maps, like all pictures, also communicate through visual, textual, and symbolic codes mutually intelligible to maker and viewer. Chorography and city views in particular invite comparison with the work of the late Ming painter Zhang Hong. As James Cahill provocatively argued, Zhang Hong's unusual treatments of space show remarkable similarities to early modern European city views, such as those of the Civitatis Orbis Terrarum, produced in Cologne by the topogeographer George Braun and the engraver Franz Hogenberg between 1572 and 1617. So give or take a century or a little bit more before Kangxi's painting. Unnaturally elevated or bird's eye points of view, shifting ground planes, hints of ocular diminution, even the use of specific motifs, all strongly indicate that European prints, including chorographies, were in circulation among select artists and intellectuals in late Ming China. Views collected by Braun and Hogenberg followed a number of basic compositions. One offers a particularly compelling comparative model for view of Rehe. In the view of Besançon, a city on the Franche-Comté border, a city in Franche-Comté near the Swiss border, in this view of Besançon, a small foreground promontory where these folks are standing affords an expansive outlook on the city and the surrounding countryside to 3 observers. Designed by Pierre d'Argent, this woodcut is an early example of what Lucia Nuti terms a, quote, perspective view. The genre combines data drawn from surveying the city with pictorial strategies embedding the urban map within a surrounding landscape and a series of non-naturalistic elements asserting the authority of the image. Like View of Rehe, Besançon does not follow a consistent perspectival method, nor even any one form of spatial construction. The viewpoint is unnaturally elevated above any available vantages. The city is positioned within a ring of surrounding hills, tilted subtly up from the predominant ground plane to make its plan more legible. The mountains, by contrast, are essentially shown frontally, the viewer gazing into the deep distance. Roughly speaking, the lines of diminution converge at the summit of the central mountain against which Besançon sits. The focal point further reinforced by the river that wraps around the city. The appearance of perspective serves to heighten a sense of eyewitness accountability. Within the city's walls, individuated structures and the twisting particularities of streets likewise reinforce the viewer's trust in the image. As a genre that existed stylistically and technologically between cartography and landscape painting, city views were rooted in first-person observation and surveying data. From the late 16th century, seeking out elevated points from which to observe and measure the city became a popular pastime in Europe among the educated elite. The portability and precision of instruments, including quadrants, sighting tubes, and surveyors' plane tables, evolved significantly during this period. City views were very much products of the studio, however, both for practical reasons and because the application of surveying data was a mathematical process, not one strictly done by the eye. Since Leon Battista Alberti's mapping of Rome in the mid-15th century, the procedures for visually rendering abstracted surveying data were well established, such that surveyor and cartographer or painter could not only be different people, but could easily be separated by both place and time. The basic tools for such measurements were present in the Qing court, well known even to the emperor through his mathematical education, as was at least one text in Chinese on their practical application. These and other devices for land measurement, such as timepieces and optical aids, were made in imperial workshops as well as being imported from Europe by the Jesuits as gifts. Kangxi is recorded by his teachers as being both familiar with the manufacture of surveying instruments. A number of extant examples from court workshops bear explicit reference to being produced at imperial command and well practiced in their use. Given Leng Mei's close connections to the study of mathematics in the court through his relationship with Jiaobing Zhen and his integral role in the development of perspective in court painting, it is reasonable to imagine that he, too, might have been acquainted with the basics of surveying. This would not have been a necessity, however, as others in the court could and most likely would have performed the fieldwork. Using a later version of Alberti's techniques, Leng Mei could have produced the more cartographic portions without ever having studied the site firsthand. In whatever ways Leng Mei employed surveying data in direct observation to construct his painting, View of Rehe is, like View of Besançon, ultimately a product of the studio. The exact methods for the selection and translation of mathematical information into a larger representational image of the site is unclear in both European and Qing cases. A partial explanation may be offered through the teaching and perspective in the court, however. The introduction of formal instruction in perspective at the Kangxi court in the 1690s coincided with the new uses of perspective, particularly the illusionistic techniques of Andrea Pozzo, as core components of the global Jesuits' mission's use of mathematics and art. Pozzo was particularly known for quadratura, a technique that extends architectural space through complex solutions used on the ceilings and walls of churches and private spaces, and for theater sets from the 15th century onwards. Giovanni Gherardini, the most significant among the Jesuit painters sent to the Kangxi court, was similarly trained in quadratura, and his ceiling in the Jesuit North Church in Beijing was one of the early monuments of illusionistic painting in the capital. Early evidence of the technique can be seen in the multiple ways in which the View of Rehe, among other works, blurs the distinction between the viewer's space and that of the painting. As with other branches of applied mathematics, the court eventually relied on a combination of imported, translated, and domestically produced texts on perspective. Pozzo's own text, Perspectiva Pictorum et Architectorum, first published in 1693, would enjoy great significance in the late Kangxi and Yangzheng courts. It served as a key source for both Giuseppe Castiglione, the most famous of the 18th century European painters in the Qing, and for the study of vision, one of several related mathematical treatises published by the official Nian Xiao between 1718 and 1735. Although Pozzo's text was likely not yet in the Kangxi in Beijing when Leng Mei executed View of Rehe, there's no reason to do that, a number of the 17th century's most important texts on perspective were. The construction of the valley and its architecture appear to involve three basic steps. In the first instance, the primary line of sight was articulated through single point convergent perspective, albeit at a quote-unquote lateral aspect, offset slightly to the right. So now we're talking about the valley, which, as we noted, was not straight on ahead of the viewer, but set off to the right of the viewer's line of sight. This had its origins in theatrical scene painting, where it extended the perspectival illusion of the sets to the wings and center of the audience alike. While these two methods assured a sense of depth in the painting, a final step allowed, I skipped a sentence. Let me start that paragraph again. The construction of the valley floor and its architecture appear to involve three basic steps. In the first instance, the primary line of sight was articulated through a single point convergent perspective, albeit at a lateral aspect, offset slightly to the right. Right, that's the main line of vision. The secondary line of sight, by which the architecture is rendered, utilizes a technique known as vedute per angolo, or angled view, right? So off with its convergent point off the picture plane to the left. This had its origins in theatrical scenery painting, where it extended the perspectival illusion of the set, of the painted sets, to the wings as well as the center of the audience. While these two methods assure a sense of depth in the painting, a final step allowed the architecture of the central lakes to be properly arrayed. Looking down, the buildings are located in precise relationship to one another, simultaneously receding along the primary and secondary lines of sight. Such arrangements appear commonly in European perspective manuals, often expressed through the depiction of complex flooring patterns. Nian Xiao includes a number of examples of this technique in the study of vision, illustrations that he characterizes not as means for illustrating inlaid floors, since those are not so common in China, but much more to the point here, more broadly as, quote, a method of creating things on a ground plane, close quote. Laid within a grid defined equally by simple geometry as by trigonometric surveying, the pavilions and halls of the mountain estate were arranged much like the individual tiles in an intricately patterned mosaic. The comparison with View in Besançon and with city views more generally suggests ways of accounting for aspects of View of Rehe's unusual compositional strategies and the means of its creation. These comparisons should not be taken as comprehensive explanation for these concerns, but instead understood in concert with other readings of the painting and the works that surrounded it in the court. While it seems quite possible, even likely, that early European city scenes were known in the Qing court, later examples of the genre offer a more proximate source. Upon their return from Paris to Beijing in 1699, Louis XIV's king's mathematicians carried with them numerous monumental volumes of the so-called King's Cabinet, a collection of hundreds of engravings of the French court bound in red calfskin and embossed with gold. Among them were a great number of landscapes, such as scenes of French cities and royal gardens. The volumes entered the Qing Imperial Library and later that of the North Church, where books in European languages were transferred under the Qianlong Emperor. Considered of exceptional quality even in Europe, the cabinet prints source, large scale, and remarkable detail would surely have been of interest to an emperor attuned to how his contemporaries presented themselves. And by large scale, I see that this caption does not have the scale. And so I'm just going to guess, because I can't quite remember, but I'm going to say that these prints, which are double wide and double fold out, so it's like a super fold out, are maybe the better. There are several prints stuck together, and maybe they're the better part of 1.5 meters wide and 75 centimeters to 1 meter tall. They're absolutely huge. They take 2 adults to move a single volume just onto the table to view them in the library. Among the prints in Louis' cabinet were a number of modern perspective and profile views that reflected up-to-date approaches to the types of choreographies included in Civitatis Urbis Terrarum. Images such as the view of the Chateau of Fontainebleau from the garden side by Israel Silvestre employed an expansive vista similar to that of Besançon, substituting a lower vantage point in more naturalistic perspective. The foreground figures are absent, replaced by a forking path that leads into a lively scene of the hunt. Although neither the scale nor the composition offer entry into the same quadratura-esque fashion as view of Rehe, the oversized format and broad outlook draw the viewer in nonetheless. It is, like earlier city scenes, an image of order, but with a changed emphasis. Here, royal pleasure and imperial sovereignty replace the natural harmony and civic peace seen in Besançon. Though compositionally different, the views of Rehe and Fontainebleau share important similarities as images of imperial authority through landscape. The two scenes naturally reflect the ways in which imperial parks, ordered, controlled landscapes reserved for an individual's pleasure, serve synectically for the empire. That this is so in both Qing and French cases is partially a function of the meanings read into gardens across a range of cultural contexts. Yet the transcultural exchange of garden images between Paris and Beijing also speaks to the ways in which landscape functioned as a medium for communication and expression in the context of early modern cosmopolitan emperorship. Part of that function was the literal and metaphoric relationship between technology, especially that of measurement, and the land. Like a painted bird's eye view, cartography constitutes a form of imperial vision, omniscient, possessing, and founded in the tension between claims to veracity and rhetorics of representation. The tensions between visual rhetoric and measurable knowledge, between idealized and literal landscapes, ultimately return us to the question with which we began, and which has been the principal occupation of those writing on the view of Rehe. What, or possibly more accurately, when, does the scroll depict? And when was it painted? In de-emphasizing, even abandoning the prospect that Leng Mei's painting will reveal something definitive about the chronology of its creation, new possibilities about its temporality come to the fore. Representing a moment when the Qing court's engagement with new fields of knowledge intersected with established epistemological, political, and scientific understandings of space, View of Rehe offers particular insight into the processes by which these encounters occurred. As others have observed with regards to applied mathematics, astronomy, and cartography in the court, this approach represents neither a hybrid nor a process of straightforward influence or accommodation. Rather, the Qing court painting style reflected in View of Rehe is one of strategic incorporation of new techniques into existing modes of picture making, coinciding with, and no doubt contributing to, a moment in which the court's perception of the ideological potential of images was changing. Ineluctably early modern in the sense of being dependent not only on the circulation of people, images, and ideas across Eurasia, but also on the engagement with the networks of cosmopolitan empire and emperorship in a global context. Leng Mei's garden portrait is also quintessentially Qing. Thank you very much for your patience. And that is that. Thank you. Wei-Shi, I don't think we can hear you, or I can't hear you.
Say thank you, Stephen. This is truly amazing. I read your book, but I had to admit it. Those your perspective, all the drawings and the scientific aspect. I often feel kind of a little bit inept to really comprehend until today. You have gone into more depth to show us how to look at and through your analysis. So truly thank you. I just want to remind our audience, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So you can type in your questions. Don't be shy. Maybe I will start one. There's so many court production of the Qing, particularly the Qianlong era. So this painting reminds me of the one dated collaborated by two court painters, Tang Dai and Shen Yuan, right, Yuan Mingyuan, dated 1744. There's some similarities, but it's kind of like a what do you call? On one hand, it's like a portion, a section of the depiction of a specific what do you call scene of Yuan Mingyuan, and but also feel like panoramic. So I feel kind of really interesting to compare these two. So anyway, this is bring up a bigger question I have. In the Qing court production, it seems that there all this new visual technology, it seems, already what do you call, the Qing court seems very aware of it, but there seems always a decision behind it. I mean, like this Leng Mei's painting, it's kind of stood up as something very unique. Because you have a lot of production in a long hand scroll, particularly, like there's a southern tubal, or along with Qianlong, and later the production of these map of the travelogue, even combined with the text and image in great detail, but not one single view. So this is the Mei painting. It's one single view, and you can say so much about all the idea there. So what happened? I mean, from the early 18th century, as you dated, this is around 1703, and to Qianlong's era. I mean, in terms of the Chinese practice. So I'm kind of just curious. Have you thought about it?
Do you mean, why is there a move from a synoptic view like this to more sort of scenic views in the Qianlong?
Yeah, or why does one kind of stand out so kind of uniquely? And another question I have is that I came across there are not as a kind of fine painting on the Bishu Sanzhuang, but with all the detail, the label of all the architectural building or whatever, and again, these the visual production. There's so many different type, and also it's extremely rich. So I haven't seen something like that, but they're different from this, but also more from a kind of synthetic, bird's eye view. So and of course, your book is so much focused on this. So I'm kind of just curious, what else are there, and what have happened in the later time, or in terms of the choice in the co-production, or any shift, of this approach.
Well, I think, I think that's a really good question, and I don't. In some sense, it's probably one that is better answered by a Qianlong expert than a Kangxi expert, or a Kangxi specialist, let's say, at best. I think one of the things that happened simply is that one of the arguments that I wanted to make in my book was that a number of the sort of Qianlong period court production is what we understand the best. It's what we have a huge surviving body of. We have a very, very deep archival record, and a number of scholars around the world have been working really intensively on the mechanics of that painting and can really nail it down with sort of remarkable specificity. The much less survives of Kangxi, both in terms of physical works of art and especially in terms of archival records. There is literally no archival document that I know of surviving relating, for instance, to Leng Mei's painting. Even what we would take as a sort of standard document in the Qianlong period, which would be the memorial that orders the making of the painting, or the memorial that acknowledges its receipt by the throne. None of that exists. But one of the things I've tried to argue is that many of the sort of core practices, the landscape technique, but also many of the sort of genres that we really associate with Qing court painting, the documentary style, certain series of landscapes, certain series of views, certain types of portraiture, many of those things have their roots in Kangxi court practice. And so I think this is a sort of, maybe this is a little bit of a lame answer, in which case I apologize. But I think what's happened in part is just time and development, that they start to play out some of the possibilities that are produced in these Kangxi works. Castiglione comes along, but also a whole generation of sort of second generation Qing court painters. You mentioned Tang Dai, but also, and Shen Yuan, but also Zhang Zongcang and lots of other people come along and start to sort of work with the possibilities that are created in the Kangxi court. However, I also think that to a certain extent, what's happened is that we just aren't aware of it. For instance, there's a quite similar painting to Leng Mei's, or a not dissimilar painting to Leng Mei's in the Shenyang Gugong, the Shenyang Palace Museum, by, I want to say Zhang Zongcang, but it's been a while since I've seen it, so I can't quite remember. But it represents the sort of missing link, if you will, between Leng Mei and those labeled maps of Bishu Shandrong that you talk about. It sort of is a halfway point in the composition, and it's not labeled, but it suggests to me the sort of way in which they get to those large maps that are now in Paris and in Washington and various other, and in Beijing as well. So I think to a certain extent, it's also a question of survival, that we may have missed out things that would make the contrast less obvious, the continuities more, or the developments more clear to us, I think.
Well, one thing I get from your book and your talk is that, and I think as Eugene very well comment on your book, that the great emperor Kangxi often in our history often been eclipsed by Qianlong. I do sense very strongly he has a even greater vision, and aesthetics is very different.
Between Kangxi and Qianlong.
That's right. Yeah.
Yes, I think that for sure is right, that there is a very different vision. But I also think that, the important, for me, the important thing was to say was that Qianlong does not follow, Qianlong may follow logically on Kangxi in some sense, but Kangxi does not, the sort of standard historical fallacy or reminder, Kangxi doesn't have to inevitably lead to Qianlong. And so understanding that they were addressing very, very different political moments, that they had different political needs, and that they were therefore trying to articulate a mode of authority. I think Kangxi was trying to articulate a mode of sort of stabilizing and consolidating authority. Qianlong was very much trying to envision an expansionist and universal authority. And though they have certain points of connection, such as relationships to Tibetan Buddhism and the Chakravartin, they also have a lot of points of real important departure, I think. By the way, I switched slides. For those of you who are wondering why I just was flipping through the slides, because someone in the chat asked if I could put this slide back up. So I've done that.
Thank you. I was just going to remind you.
In case you were curious why I was flipping around.
Yeah. I also curious, other than this Leng Mei painting, I mean, just for a commonest approach, when you're teaching the site, other than this survey, now we have a very modern map. In terms of the visual production from the Qing court, what else there?
So that's a really interesting question. So I think that there are, in terms of Bishu Shandong, there are a few things. What there is most of all are these. I showed the woodblock print earlier. Silent, hopefully you'll forgive me. I'm just going to move on to something else so we can see this. I showed this image, for instance, in the upper right, this woodblock print, and this is one of 36 so-called views or scenes of Bishu Shandong. Huishu, you mentioned the book that I did with Richard Strasberg about these 36 views. But in the Kangxi period, these exist in multiple forms. They exist in painted form, they exist in printed form, there are wood blocks, there are copperplate prints, and then there are a couple of unique examples that mix those different media up. And so already in the Kangxi period, we see signs of what really goes crazy in the Qianlong period, which is this interest in sort of variation and possibility and iteration and multiple versions and all of this. But then also Qianlong continues this type of production. He designates another 36 views of his own. They appear in a gazetteer and also in numerous versions of paintings. There are multiple album painted versions of these. There are also numerous sets, would you believe, of the 36 views on fans, which are beautiful fans that then are placed in beautiful boxes, of course, et cetera, et cetera. And then the 36 views later have a whole nother life in the late 19th century and early 20th century in commercial printing and particularly in lithographic printing in Shanghai and Tianjin and other treaty port cities, where they're produced, it seems, both for Chinese audiences and for international audiences. So one of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about are the sort of not only the relationship between real site and represented site, but also the connections across media and the sort of dialogues across media. Then there are also a variety of maps, particularly those maps that you mentioned, Huishu, that are quite large maps, the size of your dining room table, and that are in a number of collections produced between the late 18th and the late 19th century. And then more recently, what I've tried to work on some is something about the afterlives of this site, which is to say that the site largely stops being used in around 1820 when the Jiaqing emperor dies there of a stroke. And then for a number of years it goes into abeyance. Then it gains further sort of notoriety because Xianfeng flees at the end of the Second Opium War. Xianfeng flees. That's a tough phrase to say. The European armies in Beijing and goes to Bishu Shandong. So certainly in contemporary Chinese historiography, it becomes associated with the sort of national humiliation narrative. It is also a sort of major, it's a sort of in the first decades of the 20th century, it is a sort of not so easy, but a trip up from Beijing that a few particularly intrepid people take. It's seen by Sven Hedden as the sort of starting point of the Silk Road. So it's in City of Emperors, which is his big book about traveling onto the Silk Road. The City of Emperors is Chengde, and he travels there. And so, and then much more recently, there have been, not only does it figure prominently in national humiliation, but there's also Xi Jinping went there a few years ago for a visit. And so there's this sort of recycling of its imperial identity. So those are some of the different ways that I try to think about it with students. I see now that there are some questions.
Yes.
And so I will just, maybe since I'm the only one who can, or you and I can see them, I'll just read them really quickly.
Okay.
First of all, William Ma has come up from Baton Rouge to ask a really, really difficult question. What was the original placement of the painting and its original function? We don't exactly know the answer to that question because the Chenchedong, the Imperial Furnishings Archive, isn't extant for the Kangxi period. It does have that seal that you see in the top center is a Bishu Shanzhuang seal, and it is recorded at least at one point as being therefore in Chengde, though in the Shuchu Baoji it is in Beijing. I'm sorry, I can't remember offhand what building it's stored in Beijing. Probably the Yangxin, but I can't remember. So I don't think the answer to that is I don't think we exactly know. However, my guess would be that it was intended to be in Chengde originally, in Rehe originally, and that later scenes of Rehe that were displayed in Rehe, such as the banquet in 10,000 trees, which of course was, and the hunting scene that accompanied it, which of course were mounted as wall paintings in the Bishu Shanzhuang Palace, that sort of idea of depicting the place that you're standing in probably began for the Qing with this painting. That's just a guess though.
Silva Chu has a very good question. Can you read it?
So Sylvia Cho, hi Sylvia, asked, I have a question regarding the Qing Emperor's conception of the space around Bishu Shanzhuang. How would you describe the relationship between the hunting grounds, Mulan Weichang, the imperial hunting grounds, which were much further north, the Buddhist temples, which surrounded the site, and the garden palace spaces depicted in Leng Mei's painting? Would you see this as a kind of selective presentation, simultaneous expression of different functions of the site with different political agendas? Whoa. Yeah, that's I mean, the easy way out, Sylvia, is to say, yes, I would see that exactly as that. The primary function, I think, from my perspective, I think you're right to see Rehe and Mulan as being part of a sort of large network. In other words, not just all immediately local to Chengde, but as part of a single inner Asian, Manchu, Mongol, Chinese landscape, if you will. I think the primary function of that landscape in terms of its audiences were inner Mongol elites and inner Mongol groups that were the primary recipients of the hospitality that was at the center of the activities in Rehe and in Mulan. The primary function of these, besides imperial retreat and sort of mental recovery, which is what Kangxi talks about in the 36 poems, is his own sort of mental and physical health. The primary sort of realpolitik function was hospitality and also religious patronage, and that's where the Buddhist temples come in. Of course, Kangxi only has 2 Buddhist temples. Qianlong constructs another 8, is that right? And so the Buddhist nature of the landscape also changes really significantly over time. And I think that is sort of one of the cruxes of the difference in interpretation between Philippe Fauré's earlier study of the site and my own, was that he was focused substantially on Qianlong sources and therefore really focused on the Lamist Buddhist nature of the site. And for me, that's not nearly as present under Kangxi. And then finally, I think that also the site serves as a sort of distilled or idealized empire, or a distillation of the idealized Qing. And I don't want to go too far into that because it's sort of a long story, but let's say, for instance, that in addition to hosting lots of inner Asian elites over each summer, the Kangxi Emperor also regularly held, like at least once a summer, I think, held these banquets in which major officials, senior officials from each of the provinces would also come, as well as representatives of all the Mongol and Manchu elites. And so in a way, those banquets were one of many different ways in which the sort of entire empire was gathered by representation, architectural representation, landscape representation, human representation into this site that was a little bit free from Beijing and instead could represent something truly Qing. I hope that answers that question, sort of.
Can I ask one more question? The analysis of the two axes, one, the looking up to the mountain, coordinate all the mountain, the blue line to coordinate all the architectural, elements. That I am not clear, because if not this one. If this is a southern point, looking up, right? So later when I visited, very clear the main structure, but I believe that's also from Qianlong's time. It's very kind of strictly facing south. So can you explain a little bit more about this this blue line, how you view it?
Sure. So the garden, of course, as you say, faces south. But the idea in the red and blue line is both to define the vantage point or the lines of sight that are implied in the painting, right? So the first issue is the painting employs perspective. It employs two different perspectival systems, at least, but two different convergent perspectival systems, the one of the valley and the one of the buildings. And those each, because they have different vanishing points, they each have different lines of sight. Now, the red line is easy because the line of sight around which that perspective is constructed is the same, give or take, as the line of sight from which the viewer views the painting. But of course, that's not true for the architecture. The architecture, it's as though the architecture was painted from the vantage point of someone sitting in the wings of the theater, along the side, and not from seeing it from head on. So the red line, of course, corresponds to this primary point of view from the south, but the blue line corresponds from a different point of view from which you could have inspected the site, one from the southeast. So that line from the southeast comes from a place that when you visit the site, you wouldn't really ever have reason to go. It's outside the park, it's across the river, across the highway, and then across the sort of increasingly developed floodplain, and then up a hill that, insofar as I know, doesn't really have anything on it, or at least I've never been up it. And so you wouldn't have an easy time now getting to it. And as a tourist, you'd have no reason to ever even really pay attention to it. But because to do trigonometric surveying, you need to take measurements from two places. You have to take a measurement, if you can see my hands, from here and from here. And then what you do is you literally, we use the expression, but you triangulate. You mathematically determine the location of your third point because you know where you're standing. Now you figure it out here. So the argument is essentially that for both practical reasons and for perspectival reasons, there are essentially two vantage points captured in the painting.
Okay, all right.
Does that make sense?
Okay, now I got you.
Okay.
I think lastly, we have one more question at least.
Maybe it's Sylvia say thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. What time is it? Oh, it's
right.
already we're running out of the time. So I guess there's no more question. I can, we can continue have this conversation forever. I think I'm the one got really excited. I really look forward to the next one. I will organize with Cynthia and let pick your idea. You're working on something grander about the connectedness between China and Europe in pre-modern era. So I really look forward to that. And but Well, thank you again for today's
you.
talk. It's really stimulating, and I
Thank you.
think some of our graduate students, even some of them didn't pose a question. So thank you again, and hope
Thank you.
there are many more to come.
Thank you so much for having me, and have a wonderful evening, everybody. Thank you for coming.
Okay,
Take care. Have a good night.
bye-bye.
Bye-bye.